What happens when the most powerful woman in the world secretly craves the life of its most wretched? Imagine the Roman Empress. Picture her not as a person, but as an idea, a creature of silk and marble, of incense and imperial purple. She is half deity, half political symbol, gliding through the silent, sun-drenched courtyards of the Palatine Hill, a living monument to Roman virtue and stability. Her duty is to the empire. Her body is the vessel of the imperial bloodline. She is the mother of future emperors, the serene face of a world-conquering power, a living goddess cloaked in mortal flesh. But in the gilded silence of the palace, behind the marble facade and the loyal guards, a story was whispered. A story so scandalous, so utterly corrosive to the imperial image, that the historians who recorded it, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, did so with a kind of horrified fascination. They wrote of a truth so vile, they recorded it with one hand, while trying to erase it with the other. This was the story of the wife of the Emperor Claudius, a woman who held the fate of senators in the palm of her hand, who could order an execution with a quiet word, who was draped in jewels plundered from a dozen conquered nations, yet found her own fate suffocating. This wasn't a story of political assassination or a secret plot to overthrow the state. The secrets whispered about this empress were far more personal, far more disturbing. It was a story of a different kind of conquest. The story of that fateful night when she shed her identity like a snake sheds its skin, her silks, her name, her very station, and descended into the reeking, torch-lit bowels of the Subura, Rome's infamous district of crime and pleasure. She went there for one purpose: to prove, in a public, score-kept competition, that she could sexually exhaust more men than the most seasoned prostitute in the city. But to dismiss this as mere depravity is to miss the point entirely. To label it simple lust is to ignore the terrifying lesson hidden within it. This is not simply a tale of a nymphomaniac empress. It is a psychological autopsy of absolute power and the profound, terrifying emptiness it creates. It is a journey into the abyss that opens when a human being is given everything, only to discover they have nothing at all. A voyage into the mind of a woman who could command the world, but could not silence the demons roaring within it. To understand the abyss, we must first understand the cage, the gilded, impossibly beautiful cage of the Roman Empress. The Empress of Rome was not a ruler. She was a political instrument of the highest order, a living seal on a dynastic contract. Her value, measured in the cold calculus of Roman power, was almost entirely biological. Her primary, and for some, her only function was to produce a healthy male heir. From the moment she married into the imperial family, her life ceased to be her own. It became a state asset. Every meal she ate, every hour she slept. Every public appearance she made was scrutinized. Her friendships were political alliances. Her private conversations were potential conspiracies. Her womb was not a part of her body. It was a vessel belonging to the Roman people. Privacy, as we know it, did not exist. She was under constant surveillance, not just by guards and servants, but by the crushing weight of expectation from the entire world. This was the world Valeria Messalina was born into. She was a product of the bluest blood in Rome, a great-grandniece of the divine Augustus himself. Her lineage was impeccable. Her marriage, however, was not. She was wedded to Tiberius Claudius, a man nearly 30 years her senior. Before his improbable ascension to the throne, Claudius had been the laughingstock of the imperial court. Afflicted with a limp, a stammer, and a slight deafness, he was considered an embarrassment, a relic kept hidden from public view. The elite families of Rome looked down on him, and by extension, the young woman forced to marry him. Then, in the bloody chaos following the assassination of Caligula, the Praetorian Guard, in a bizarre twist of fate, found Claudius hiding behind a curtain and declared him emperor. Suddenly, Messalina, the wife of the court fool, was the most powerful woman on earth. She was Empress. But this sudden elevation did not break the cage. It only made the bars stronger and plated them in gold. She was now worshipped, her likeness stamped onto coins, statues of her erected in temples. But she was worshipped as a symbol, the Augusta, the Empress, not as Messalina, the woman. The luxury was suffocating. The reverence was a form of imprisonment. The endless wealth and adoration created a psychological vacuum, a hollow space at the center of her being that no amount of power could fill. It was in this gilded cage that Messalina discovered her true power. It did not lie in the Senate, which she could not attend. It did not lie in commanding armies, a right reserved for men. Her power, she quickly realized, was rooted in two things: her absolute, almost hypnotic influence over the aging, often oblivious Emperor Claudius, and her own body, which she began to wield with the precision of a master assassin. She learned that her sexuality was a weapon, a currency more potent than gold. In the treacherous corridors of the Palatine Hill, where every favor had a price and every secret could be leveraged, Messalina turned the imperial bedchamber into her personal war room. Favors could be granted to lovers. Fortunes could be made by those who pleased her. Political careers could be launched on the strength of a shared secret. But the weapon had a double edge. For every man she elevated, she created a dozen enemies. For every secret she shared, she made herself vulnerable. The same weapon she used to control others could be used to destroy her. She began to test the boundaries of her cage, first with caution, then with a growing recklessness. She rewarded handsome courtiers and intelligent freedmen with her attention, showering them with gifts and political appointments. Claudius, either infatuated or willfully blind, seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care. He was busy managing the vast bureaucracy of the empire, leaving the intricate politics of the court to his young, ambitious wife. This set the stage for a dangerous game. Messalina was not merely indulging in affairs. She was building a shadow court, a network of allies bound to her by shared secrets and illicit pleasures. She began to believe that the normal rules of Roman society, the strict moral codes that applied to every other noblewoman, did not apply to her. As Empress, she believed she was above them. The court itself was not a safe place to play such a game. It was a nest of vipers, a whispering gallery of ambition, jealousy, and betrayal. Every noble family wanted a piece of the imperial power. Every courtier was watching, waiting for a sign of weakness. Messalina's growing boldness, her open secret of infidelity, was not just a moral failing in their eyes. It was a political vulnerability. A vulnerability that her enemies, and in Rome, everyone was a potential enemy, could exploit. She was walking a tightrope over a pit of hungry lions, and with every step, with every new lover, with every audacious act, she seemed to grow more confident, more certain that the rope would never break, that she would never fall. It was a fatal miscalculation, born from the intoxicating illusion of absolute power. The very power that had created the emptiness inside her was now convincing her that she was invincible. The cage was becoming a stage, and Messalina was preparing for a performance that would either solidify her power forever or bring the entire world crashing down upon her. This was the context for her descent. It was not a sudden plunge into madness, but a gradual, deliberate walk down a path of increasing risk. She was testing the limits of her reality, pushing against the bars of her cage to see if they would bend or break. She was at war, not with a foreign enemy, but with her own suffocating existence. The noblewomen of Rome were expected to be chaste, dignified, and invisible. Messalina, in her gilded prison, decided she would be the opposite of all three. She would not be invisible. She would become a spectacle. Messalina's descent was not a fall, it was a methodical, terrifying escalation. A woman testing the very fabric of reality to see how far it would stretch before it tore. She did not suddenly awaken as a sexual predator. She evolved into one, step by calculated step. The first stage was rebellion in darkness. Her initial affairs were likely born of a desperate need to reclaim ownership of herself, a frantic attempt to feel something real within the sterile, performative world of the imperial court. These were clandestine encounters, shrouded in the secrecy of the palace's labyrinthine corridors. A handsome guard, a charismatic senator, a talented actor brought in for the emperor's entertainment. These were acts of quiet defiance. They were assertions that her body, the property of the Roman state, still belonged to her. Each secret tryst was a small victory, a temporary escape from the golden cage. In these moments she was not the Augusta, she was Messalina, a woman driven by desire, not duty. This phase was about survival, about carving out a small private space in a life that had no privacy. But secrecy is a difficult habit for a woman who believed she was the center of the universe. The second stage began, the stage of public recklessness. The thrill of the secret was no longer enough. The power she felt in these encounters began to bleed into her public life. Her affairs became less secret and more of an open secret, a dangerous rumor whispered with both fear and fascination throughout the Roman elite. She would favor her lovers openly, securing them promotions, gifting them estates, and inviting them into the most intimate circles of imperial power. This was a profound psychological shift. She was no longer just seeking pleasure. She was broadcasting her immunity. Each glance of acknowledgement towards a lover in a crowded room, each political appointment granted to an undeserving but handsome young senator, was a declaration. It was a message to the rest of the Roman aristocracy. I can do what you would be executed for. Your rules, your morals, your laws of honor and fidelity, they do not apply to me. I am the exception. This was the intoxication of impunity. Claudius remained oblivious, insulated by a wall of sycophants and his own trusting nature. Messalina, emboldened by his inaction, began to believe she was truly untouchable. The fear of being caught was replaced by the arrogant thrill of almost being caught and getting away with it. The cage, in her mind, was beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a playground where she was the only one who knew the rules. This arrogance led directly to the third, and most monstrous stage, the weaponization of sex. The line between desire and power dissolved completely. Sex was no longer an escape or a statement. It became her primary tool of political terror. This is where the historical accounts of Tacitus and Suetonius, two of Rome's most respected and feared historians, begin to paint a truly chilling portrait. They wrote not of a passionate woman, but of a cold, calculating predator. Messalina began to compel men to sleep with her. These were no longer invitations, but summonses. High-ranking senators, decorated generals, respected noblemen, men who had built their careers on public dignity and Roman gravitas, would receive a message from the palace. It was a command performance they could not refuse. To accept was to become complicit in her web of intrigue, to be bound to her by a shared treasonous secret. They would be rewarded, of course, with political appointments, lucrative contracts, or the emperor's favor, channeled through his wife. They became her creatures. But to refuse was death. The historian Tacitus recounts the story of Valerius Asiaticus, a wealthy and influential former consul. Messalina coveted his magnificent gardens, but more than that, she coveted him. When he rebuffed her advances, she did not react with the scorn of a rejected lover. She reacted with the fury of an empress whose authority had been challenged. She conspired with one of her allies to accuse Asiaticus of treason and adultery. The charges were ludicrous, but in the paranoid atmosphere of Claudius's court, they were enough. Asiaticus was forced to commit suicide to preserve what little was left of his family's honor and fortune. His gardens became Messalina's property. Her cruelty was not limited to the men. The wives of the Roman elite lived in a state of constant terror. If their husbands were too handsome, they feared Messalina would summon them. If their husbands refused, they feared for their lives. If their husbands complied, they were forced to endure the humiliation in silence. To protest, to show any sign of jealousy, was to mark oneself for destruction. Messalina, according to the records, would invent charges against any woman she perceived as a rival, either for a man's affection or for her own political standing. This was a reign of terror conducted not with legions and swords, but in the bedrooms and banquet halls of Rome. It was a brilliant, perverse system of control. She had turned the ultimate act of vulnerability into an expression of absolute dominance. She was consuming the Roman elite, one man at a time, turning their honor into her plaything and their fear into her shield. Now, it is crucial to add a layer of historical context here. The historians who chronicled Messalina's reign, primarily Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, were all men of the senatorial class. They wrote from a perspective that was inherently hostile to powerful women, and deeply resentful of an imperial system that had stripped their class of its traditional power. It is entirely possible, even probable, that they exaggerated Messalina's depravity. They may have used her as a symbol of the corruption and moral decay of the Claudian court, a convenient scapegoat for the sins of the era. The trope of the sexually insatiable, power-hungry woman was a common one in Roman political rhetoric. However, even if we account for this potential bias, the sheer volume and consistency of the accusations from multiple sources suggest that there was a terrifying reality behind the stories. They may have embellished the details, but the core truth remains. Messalina had discovered that in a world governed by rigid rules of conduct, the most powerful position belongs to the person willing to break all of them. She had pushed against the bars of her cage and found that they were not made of steel, but of fear. And now that she knew her power, she began to wonder what would happen if she didn't just bend the bars, but left the cage entirely. She had conquered the palace. She had conquered the nobility. There was only one world left to conquer: the gutter. The Palatine Hill was a world unto itself, a gleaming island of marble, order, and immense wealth floating above the chaotic sea of Rome. From its manicured gardens, Messalina could look down upon the sprawling city, a million souls teeming in the labyrinth below. And her eyes would have been drawn to one place in particular, the Subura. The Subura was the city's dark, beating heart, a dense, filthy, and vibrant slum packed into the valley between the Viminal and Esquiline hills. It was the absolute antithesis of her world. The Palatine was silent. The Subura screamed with the noise of 1,000 workshops, taverns, and arguments. The Palatine was perfumed with incense and flowers. The Subura reeked of sweat, sewage, and cheap wine. The Palatine was a place of immense, unspoken power. The Subura was a place of raw, brutal survival. And it was home to Rome's sprawling, officially tolerated prostitution industry. For a woman like Messalina, a woman who had systematically dismantled every sexual taboo within the sterile confines of the court, the Subura represented the final frontier. It was the ultimate test. One night, according to the account of the historian Pliny the Elder, a man known more for his obsessive cataloging of the natural world than for salacious gossip, which lends his account a chilling air of credibility. Messalina decided to cross that frontier. This was not a whim, it was a ritual, a deliberate and symbolic act of transformation. She waited until the Emperor Claudius was sound asleep. Then she began the process of shedding her skin. The imperial silks were replaced with the coarse, cheap tunic of a common streetwalker. The intricate imperial hairstyle was hidden beneath a cheap, brightly colored blonde wig, the customary mark of a Roman prostitute. The jewels were left behind. Her personal guards were ordered to accompany her, not as protectors of the Empress, but as the entourage of a common whore. She gave herself a new name for the night, Lysiska, the she-wolf. It was a name dripping with the predatory, primal energy she sought. She was no longer Valeria Messalina, descendant of Augustus, wife of the emperor. She was Lysiska, a creature of the night, a huntress in the urban wilderness of the Subura. Her destination was a specific lupanar, or brothel. It was not a high-class establishment that catered to senators, but a common dive, grimy and filled with sailors, merchants, and off-duty soldiers. And it was here that the challenge was laid down. The opponent was Scylla, the brothel's most famous and productive prostitute, a woman whose reputation for stamina was legendary in the Roman underworld. The contest, as recorded by Pliny, was brutally simple. A direct, head-to-head competition to see who could service more men before dawn. The score would be kept. The prize was not money, but something far more important to Messalina: victory, the title of the undisputed champion. Why? This is the central terrifying question. Why would the most powerful woman in the world engage in such a grotesque and dangerous act? The answer lies not in simple lust, but in the twisted psychology of absolute power and the profound emptiness it had carved into her soul. First, it was the ultimate act of rebellion against the crushing boredom of her existence. The golden cage had become so suffocating that the only way to feel alive was to flirt with total self-destruction. The risk of being recognized, the physical danger, the sheer filth of the experience, all of it was a jolt of adrenaline, a dose of reality in a life that had become an artificial performance. In the brothel, she was not a symbol. She was a body, a participant in the most basic and raw of human transactions. For a few hours she could feel the grit and grime of a life that was brutally, unapologetically real. Second, it was the final frontier of her addiction to power. Messalina was a conqueror. She had sexually and politically subjugated the Roman aristocracy. She had proven she was the master of the Palatine Hill, but that victory now felt hollow. To truly prove her dominance, she had to descend into the opposing world, the world of the gutter, and conquer it on its own terms. It wasn't enough to be the most powerful noblewoman. She had to prove she was better at being a prostitute than an actual prostitute. It was a perverse desire to master every domain, to leave no world unconquered, no competition unwon. Finally, and perhaps most tragically, it was an act of profound self-hatred. It was a subconscious attempt to become the monster that her enemies and her own suffocating role had made her feel she was. If the world was going to see her as a depraved creature, she would not only embrace the role, she would perfect it. It was a desperate, self-destructive cry for help, an attempt to shatter the pristine marble image of the Empress and show the world the broken, empty person underneath. It was a form of self-punishment, a way to physically manifest the moral decay she felt within. Pliny the Elder records the outcome of the contest with his typical, matter-of-fact precision. As dawn approached, Scylla, exhausted, gave up. But Messalina, the Empress Lysiska, continued. She did not stop until the brothel owner forced her to. The final score, according to Pliny, was 25 men. Messalina had won. Imagine the scene. The she-wolf, Empress of Rome, standing victorious in the squalid room of a back-alley brothel, her body aching, her disguise in tatters. She had proven her point. She was the champion. She had conquered the Suburra. But as the first rays of sunlight pierced the grimy window, the adrenaline would have faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow reality. The victory brought no satisfaction, no peace. The emptiness was still there, perhaps even larger than before. She had left the cage for a night, only to discover that the cage was not the palace. The cage was herself, and from that there was no escape. A victory in the gutter cannot save you from a fall from the throne. Messalina's nocturnal conquests and her reign of terror at court had created a reality distortion field around her. She had survived so many scandals, eliminated so many enemies, and bent the emperor so completely to her will that she began to believe she was not just untouchable, but infallible. This fatal arrogance led her to her final and greatest miscalculation. It was an act so audacious, so openly treasonous, that it finally pierced the bubble of Claudius's willful ignorance. Her ultimate obsession became Gaius Silius, a handsome and intelligent senator-elect who was widely regarded as one of the most promising men in Rome. He was everything Claudius was not: young, charismatic, and physically perfect. For Messalina, he was not just another lover, he was a potential partner. A man she could perhaps mold into a new emperor, with herself as the true power behind the throne. She forced him to divorce his noble wife and become her exclusive lover, showering him with wealth and political power. But this was not enough. In the year 48 AD, while the Emperor Claudius was away from Rome, attending a ceremony at the port of Ostia, Messalina committed her final, inexplicable act. She decided to marry Gaius Silius. This was not a secret ceremony. It was a public wedding, complete with a signed contract, witnesses, and a lavish feast, all conducted with the full rites of a traditional Roman marriage. It was an act of breathtaking insanity. This was not adultery, this was bigamy. In the eyes of Roman law and tradition, it was a declaration that her marriage to Claudius was over. It was a direct public repudiation of the emperor. It was, in short, high treason. What was she thinking? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it a genuine, albeit insane, coup attempt to replace Claudius with Silius? Or was it the ultimate act of a self-destructive thrill-seeker, a woman so addicted to risk that she had to gamble with her own life and the stability of the empire itself? The answer is likely a combination of both. She had grown to despise the aging Claudius and believed her own power was absolute. She thought she could install a new husband and force the world to accept it. But she had underestimated one thing: the fear of the emperor's inner circle. The powerful freedmen who advised Claudius, men like Narcissus and Pallas, had long tolerated Messalina's excesses because she was useful to them. But this was different. A new emperor meant a new court, and their own positions and very likely their lives would be forfeit. For them, Messalina was no longer a useful tool. She was an existential threat. It was Narcissus who finally acted. He rushed to Ostia and revealed the entire affair to Claudius. The historian Tacitus describes the scene with vivid detail. Claudius was paralyzed by disbelief and fear. He was not the furious, betrayed husband. He was the terrified emperor, suddenly confronted with the reality of a conspiracy he could no longer ignore. It was Narcissus who had to stiffen his spine, issuing orders in the emperor's name and organizing the Praetorian Guard to secure Rome. The end came swiftly. Silius and his co-conspirators were rounded up and executed without delay. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, the very property she had stolen from Valerius Asiaticus. The bubble of her invincibility had burst. She was no longer the Empress, the untouchable she-wolf. She was a terrified, abandoned woman. Her power evaporated in an instant. Claudius wavered. There was a moment when it seemed his affection for her might win out over his fear. He spoke of allowing her to plead her case the next day. Narcissus knew he could not let that happen. Fearing that Messalina would once again seduce the emperor into forgiving her, he took matters into his own hands. He sent a tribune and a handful of centurions to the gardens with one simple order: execute her. Her death was not the noble suicide of a Roman aristocrat. It was a grim, pathetic scene. She was found with her mother, who begged her to take her own life with dignity. But Messalina's nerve failed her. She wept and hesitated until the tribune, growing impatient, drew his sword and ran her through. She was 28 years old. In the aftermath, the Senate convened. Eager to please the emperor and erase the stain of her reign, they decreed a damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. It was the ultimate Roman punishment. Her name was to be chiseled off every public monument. Her statues were to be torn down. Her very existence was to be scrubbed from the official record of the Roman people. They wanted her to vanish, to become a ghost. A cautionary tale whispered, but never officially acknowledged. And here lies the final, sublime irony of history. Their attempt to annihilate her memory is the very reason she is immortal. The vicious, detailed accounts written by her enemies, the very documents meant to serve as her indictment, became her biography. In their desperate effort to portray her as a monster, they etched her into the memory of Western civilization forever. She became a symbol, not of virtue, but of the explosive, destructive potential of a woman trapped within a system of absolute, soul-crushing power. She has been judged by history as a demon, a nymphomaniac, a monster. But her story forces us to ask a more difficult question. Was her depravity the cause of the rot, or was it merely a symptom of a political system so corrupt, so perverse and power-mad that it was even more diseased than she was? In the end, who was the real monster? The woman who broke every rule in a desperate attempt to feel alive, or the world that created her, caged her, and then destroyed her for trying to escape?